Victory, tragedy, poverty. By the end of World War II, Europe had been ripped apart at its seams. The globe's second extended industrial-scale conflict had exhausted every power on the continent, allied or Axis. The eventual victory of the former came at a massive human and economic cost. Another generation of young men was thrown into the brutal meat grinder of modern warfare, their families left with no foreseeable means of long-term sustenance after the war. During the conflict, entire national economies were redirected towards the war effort and left in tatters after the signings of the Paris Treaties. Formerly wealthy, prosperous commercial and residential districts in major cities like London and Munich, once the epitome of global civilization, were bombed to ashes. Yet most tragically, the humiliated desperation of the German people and the megalomaniacal ruthlessness of their leaders resulted in the deaths of nearly 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. After the Second Great War, Europeans basically snapped out of a trance. Gone was the antebellum nationalistic fervor, the urge to pursue vengeance and escalate international crises tit for tat. Instead, among the ruins, resentment, and despair, a terrifying existential question rose to the forefront of Western consciousness. What now? Yet from the ashes of this devastating conflict rose the phoenix of an invigorated United States. Using its newly obtained international power, it spearheaded initiatives such as the Marshall Plan, which transferred large amounts of foreign aid for the reconstruction of Europe and facilitated international cooperation amongst non-communist powers. President Truman and the 80th Congress hoped that their cornerstone foreign policy institution, the United Nations, would usher in an era of multilateralism and dialogue. According to their idealistic vision of the world moving forward, rather than issue ultimatums via telegram, European powers would discuss their disagreements in an open forum arbitrated by their peers and be held accountable to predictable, universal legal norms. In this newly formed United Nations, the victors divided up their spoils, the entire world, redrawing global boundaries in Africa, Eastern Europe, East Asia, and most topically, the Middle East. On November 29, 1947, when the United Nations agreed to pass Resolution 181 and relinquish Great Britain's Palestinian land claims to a Jewish ethno-state, they created a refuge for the long-persecuted Jewish culture at last, but did so at the expense of established Arab peoples in the region. Thus, the founding and international recognition of Israel as a modern Jewish nation-state sowed the seeds of a persistent cultural tension that would endure even into the 21st century, while permanently securing a foothold for international Western powers in the Arab world. For Zionist Jews, this was a triumph of pan-European foreign policy in guaranteeing Jewish sovereignty at last. For Palestinian Arabs, this is a tragedy of displacement and political exclusion. Though the modern state of Israel was only formally established during the late 1940s due to the formal recognition of its sovereignty by the UN, its formation was the result of far-reaching, powerful historical trends. The specific city of Jerusalem, located in the Palestinian region, holds immense significance in the Jewish religion. It is the holy city, the designated capital of the Israeli state. More specifically, the Temple Mount is the most sacred earthly location for Judaism, where two temples built by Jewish religious figures, King Solomon and King David, once stood, and where God's presence is most powerful according to the Jewish religion. Thus, since the time of the Roman Empire, after the Jews were driven out of this region, there has long been a sizable Jewish presence as well as a cultural desire to reestablish this homeland on a larger scale. However, Arabs had already settled in most of the Middle East, including Palestine, for hundreds of years. They also recognized this region as home. To further complicate matters, a holy Islamic site and one of the oldest pieces of Islamic architecture, the Dome on the Rock, is located at the same spot, the Temple Mount. Their extreme geographic proximity ratcheted up existing tensions between Jewish and Muslim communities, leading to intolerance or even sporadic outbursts of violence. Most notably, the local Arab population aggressively retaliated against the increasing presence of Zionist settlements during the Jaffa riots of 1921, leading to the deaths of nearly 100 Jews and Arabs. Since the late 1800s, in response to increased anti-Semitic violence, European Jews sought to migrate to existing settlements in the Palestine area. Prominent Austro-Hungarian activist Theodor Herzl is credited with popularizing the Zionist movement. In the face of thousands of deaths due to pogroms or mass lynchings of Jewish people in hyper-nationalist European enclaves, Jews like Herzl dreamed of establishing their own autonomous government, appealing to the media and national governments for support. He distributed pamphlets, delivered speeches, and provided testimony to influential organizations such as the British Royal Commission, but ultimately to no avail. During this period, up until the beginning of World War II, Great Britain controlled the region of Palestine and implemented strongly pro-Arab, anti-Jewish policies to appease their Arab economic and political allies. These measures included strong restrictions on Jewish immigration and property ownership in the region. Only after World War II, when the non-Jewish public support for Zionism reached an all-time high after the horrors of the Holocaust were exposed, did the British government begin implementing uneasy, convoluted plans. Finally, after prolonged negotiations, controversy, and eventual resolution, this decades-long mission was complete. The Jewish Agency's chief executive, David Ben-Gurion, proudly declared Israel an independent state, ready to be reoccupied by Jewish settlers.
The White House welcomes the Prime Minister of Israel for the first of his series of talks with Western leaders. David Ben-Gurion is stopping in Washington, New York, and chief European capitals to get an estimate of the political atmosphere as the summit conference approaches. He meets for 2 hours with President Eisenhower.
Despite conflict after conflict with Arab neighbors who opposed the Jewish presence, including the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Six-Day War, and the Yom Kippur War, Israel has persisted. Continuing to build its economic and diplomatic might in the middle of this political upheaval. The historical impact of the Israeli state is principally twofold. First, domestically, this unprecedented majority Jewish state reversed the power dynamic between the Jews and the European nations. Rather than perpetually retaining minority status, remaining subject to the whims of dominant ethnic groups like the French, Germans, and Russians, Jewish people were able to exercise national autonomy and provide refuge for any Jews escaping persecution or discrimination in Israel. Unfortunately, Jewish empowerment also aggravated hostilities. The already settled Palestinian Arabs were not represented adequately in the Israeli legislature and frequently protested against or attacked Israel's government for unlawful land seizure, property demolition, and civilian killings. As the Israeli people gained independence and fulfillment, they seized those same rights from already entrenched Palestinians. Even in the modern day, this clash of cultural interests continues to generate controversy and hostility, marked by frequent violent confrontations and vicious PR battles. The second impact of Israel's founding is more global in scale. Because the young nation was surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors who strongly opposed the large Jewish presence on ideological grounds, the Israeli government has relied on strong political and economic ties with Europe to endure and prosper. Thus, Israel has served as a consistent pro-democracy, pro-liberalism linchpin in the region, conducting joint military operations with Western allies in exchange for extensive foreign aid and preferential diplomatic treatment. Thanks to Europe's multilateral effort, Israel was finally conclusively established. Despite the tragic humanitarian impacts of its conflicts with Palestinian Arabs and neighboring nations, the Jewish state has weathered the storm and carved out a place for itself in the Middle East. At long last, the promised land was secured.